The next kind of preferences we're going to look at is for bads, rather than kind of the goods that we've been looking at. So bads are a commodity that the consumer doesn't like. Commodities that a consumer doesn't like. For example, let's look at two goods, just like the text. We have pepperoni, which we're going to think of as a good, and anchovies, which are bads, let's say, for now. Apologies if you like anchovies. So let's imagine that we have, a good and a bad, and we're trying to draw the indifference curves for that situation. And imagine that we have this trade-off that the consumer is willing to make between pepperoni and anchovies, in the sense that as long as they get compensated enough pepperoni, they're willing to have some anchovies. So let's imagine there is some trade-off the consumer is willing to make between pepperoni and anchovies. In the sense that, like I said before, the consumer is willing to have, some anchovies if they're compensated enough with more pepperoni. So if we wanted to draw this situation, we could have this good pepperoni on the x-axis and anchovies on the right, on the y. And so this idea that the consumer wants more pepperoni, but anchovies is kind of a bad, but there's some trade-off between the two. Well, we're going to have some indifference curves that are these kind of like, if there's a constant trade-off, they're going to be straight lines. Let's say this is I1, for instance. And so basically, to have more anchovies to go up, we need to be compensated with more pepperoni. And instead of indifference curves further away from the origin being more preferred, it's actually going to be kind of going down, or going kind of to the right, that's going to give us higher utility or higher satisfaction. We prefer, so I3 is preferred, not even weakly, strictly preferred to every bundle on I2 to every bundle on I1. So higher utility kind of goes this way. Because and it kind of makes sense when you just look at the indifference curves. With this bundle on I1 and this bundle on I3, we have the same amount of pepperoni, but with bundle X, we have more anchovies. And since anchovies is a bad, this should have lower utility. So that kind of makes sense that utility is kind of going up as we kind of go this way. So that's what bads look like. And so these are kind of different kind of looking indifference curves, but we can handle situations like that, right? We just have to think logically through what these preferences would look like for these different situations. So the fourth example we could look at are neutrals. And this is, as the name suggests, this is just where a consumer doesn't care one way or another. Consumer does not care about the good. One way or another. And sorry, I should commodity is maybe the better word there. Because good is implying something about it, right? So we have goods and we have bads. The consumer doesn't really care about the commodities. Maybe I'll just be careful and I'll X that in. The commodity one way or another. So let's imagine we have the same situation before, example, same goods, anchovies and pepperoni. I don't know what happened to that E there. But now let's, instead of anchovies being a bad, let's just consider them as being neutral. You don't really care. They'll have as many anchovies as they'll put on your pizza. You don't really care how many anchovies there are. But pepperoni is good in the sense that you want more of it. Well, what would these preferences look like? So here are anchovies again. We do have to think about which good we put on which axis, because that would determine the shape of the indifference curves, right? Pepperoni. And now, like, we can have as many anchovies as, we're kind of indifferent, we're neutral to anchovies. We really only care about pepperoni, we want more pepperoni. So for instance, here is indifference curve 1. Here is indifference curve 2, and there's kind of these straight lines or vertical lines. And we're going to get a higher utility as we go to the right here. Because again, we don't care how many anchovies we have in our pizza, we just care about how much pepperoni we have. Or we prefer more pepperoni than less. And so, utility is going up as we move to the right. So I3 is strictly preferred to I2, which is strictly preferred to I1. So we can deal with those situations as well with preferences. Again, it's just kind of logically thinking through how to represent this situation with indifference curves. So the fifth example of preferences is if we have some satiation or bliss point. Satiation or bliss point. And so this is this idea that there's some perfect bundle that the consumer wants. There's some particular best bundle, some combination, or some amount of good 1 and good 2 that the consumer wants. And it's exactly that bundle. So there is some quote unquote best bundle. And the closer the consumer is to that bundle, the better off they are. The individual is to that bundle, the better off they are. So for example, let's say we have this bliss point, or the best bundle, is like some x bar, which is some amount of x1, some amount of good 1, so x1 bar of good 1, and x2 bar of good 2. So here's our plane, here's x2, or good 2, here's the amount of good 1. Now let's say we have this x2 bar and x1 bar here, and so that's right around here, and this is our best bundle. That's the satiation point, or the bliss point. We want to consume that exact amount, and the closer we are to that point, the better off, or the happier we are. Well, what's going to happen here, the indifference curves are going to be like circles around this point. So maybe this is like I3, and this is I2, and we have a larger one, I1, and our utilities, or our utility or happiness is better off the closer we are to this point. So that's kind of what the indifference curves would look like for some satiation. If there's some situation where one particular bundle, such as x1 bar and x2 bar, is like the bundle we want. We want to be as close to that point as possible. So they look a bit different than some of the other indifference curves we've been looking at. So the final kind of example of preferences that we should talk about or discuss are discrete goods. So many goods can only be consumed in discrete amounts. in discrete amounts. For example, cars. You can't have like a fraction of a car or something like that. You buy a car or you don't. Rather than fractional amounts. For instance, something like beer, you could have like 1 1/4 beer, or you can like exactly have fractional amounts of a beer or something like that. And what these discrete, if you wanted to represent things in discrete terms, you would good that we could only purchase in discrete terms or amounts. This would turn, instead of having like indifference curves, they'd be like a series of points, at those discrete amounts. If you're talking about cars, if you couldn't purchase a fraction of a car or consume a fraction of a car, you'd have 1, 2, 3. They'd be at discrete points rather than this nice curve that's happening. Turns indifference, quote unquote, curves into a series of points. Now, this is true for a number, lots of goods you might be interested in. The key here is to kind of think about how important this discrete number is. Like how important that it's a discrete good, how important is that for our analysis? So we can choose whether to emphasize the discrete nature of it. Of the good or not. And kind of whether you want to do or not kind of depends on the situation that you're looking at. So for example, if you had a good that's, you're going to have 1 or 2 of the good, maybe it's important to emphasize the nature of it. So it might be important to emphasize the discrete nature of the good. If we're going to purchase like 1 or 2 of these goods, or maybe the goods are like children or something like that, and they come in like whole amounts, right? So it might be really important. We have low numbers of goods that we kind of emphasize that discrete nature of the good. But if we're in some situation that we're thinking about, oh, this person's going to buy 39 or 40, whatever, beer or something like that. You can only buy beers in whole amounts for the most part. But it might be less important to kind of underline the nature of the discrete nature of the good in this situation. Something like where you're having 39 or 40, it's probably, you can probably just start to treat it as a continuous good. Where you can have fractions of the good. So it kind of depends on the situation. For the most part, we're going to kind of treat a lot of these goods as fractional or continuous. So we have indifference curves rather than a series of kind of points for discrete goods.